When the story is told, it's often told from a white perspective, always, when it's told. It was all about colonization. It's European powers. It's Americans fighting the British, right? But the real story is the story of the people that were living there. It's told from the European perspective, rather than the perspective of the black people that were living there and the indigenous people that were living there. That's what we're trying to do is change that. First of all, A, just tell the story, but B, tell the story the way it needs to be told. This is a site in the Apalachicola National Forest, not far from Tallahassee, about an hour west on the Apalachicola River. It was a site where 200 years ago, during the War of 1812, there was a free black community there. There was probably one of the largest free black communities in North America that people don't know about. Negro Fort was a site where, during the War of 1812, for those who don't know, that was when the United States was fighting against Great Britain. The British came here to what was in Spanish Florida, right? It wasn't even a state, it wasn't a territory, there was no enslavement here yet. There were already free black people living here in Spanish Florida because they could, because it was a place to escape to. So people were coming here from the northern states and coming into Florida, living here alongside the creek and the Seminoles, here. When the British came, they recruited everybody they could that wanted to fight against the Americans and offered them free British citizenship. And so a number of free black people already here in Florida, and people that heard about it and escaped from plantations in Georgia and the Carolinas, came here, joined the British, signed up, and were trained as British colonial Marines to fight against the Americans in the War of 1812. They fought in Pensacola, in Mobile. They fought in the famous Battle of New Orleans against Andrew Jackson. Black men in redcoats fighting against the Americans because they could, right? Many of them left with the British after the war, and they were resettled in colonies in the Caribbean. There were still hundreds of people that stayed behind. So you had a community of hundreds of free black men, women, and children living on the Apalachicola River with a fort that was partially built by the British, but then they continued to build it themselves, built a village within that fort, and started building communities and farms up and down the river. And for a year and a half, they lived there free until the Americans attacked again. Because you can't have, at the time, the Americans were trying to take Florida from Spain. Andrew Jackson had his designs on this area because the rich soil around here is perfect for growing that new crop that was becoming so profitable, cotton. But you can't have a fort full of free, armed black people here in Florida in the way of that. And so they came here and they attacked the fort. They used excuses. They called them, the people living there called them land pirates. That was Andrew Jackson's. They were land pirates because that allowed them to use the excuse of international piracy laws to allow them to invade Spanish territory to attack them. Even then, they were using political excuses, the kind of thing you would do today, right, for fighting an illegal war. Make up a fake excuse to do it. That's what the Americans did. American gunboat fired a cannonball, a heated cannonball, and it hit the powder magazine in the fort. It caused a tremendous explosion. It killed almost 300 people, many of them women and children, instantly. And it was a horrific tragedy. But there were survivors, people that got out before, people that escaped. They went on to join up with the Miccosukee here in Tallahassee. They would join with the Seminoles. They would continue to fight. They used the training they got from the British to train others, to train the next generation, to keep fighting against the Americans during the Seminole Wars, right? And that's where the Black Seminoles come from. One of the people that was at Fort Negro there on the Apalachicola River, a man named Abraham, went on to become one of the leaders of the Black Seminoles, fighting against the Americans for decades. Ultimately, he ended up sitting down and signing a treaty in the 1840s to what he thought would protect his people in exchange for land in Oklahoma. But that was Indian territory. That was the Trail of Tears. There were black people on the Trail of Tears.
The Black Seminoles, were they descendants of Africans?
They were, yes. They mixed with indigenous communities, with the Creek and Seminoles. People mixed. They would often have their own villages side by side with indigenous villages. But certainly people were intermarrying. Black Seminoles continued to fight against the Americans. Some of them left Florida altogether. They got pushed all the way down into the Everglades, and they finally built boats and sailed to the Bahamas. They went out to Oklahoma. They lived out there. Abraham himself went up crossing the border into Mexico and starting a free black community in Mexico, where people went to, right? How free is it, though, if you're always looking over your shoulder? If there's always the threat of re-enslavement? And that's what they had to live with, but they did what they could. One of the things we found with the archaeology is, how they took the start of what was a British fort there, And they started building their own. They stopped building the British fort once the British left, and they started building their own things there. They built a palisade around the village, like a walled wooden stockade around a village, just like what the kind of wooden stockades you would see in West African villages. They started doing their own thing. We're seeing that with the archaeology now, just with the ground penetrating radar. Those stories aren't told. Always, it's just finding, it's not even about fighting for freedom, although they did. It was about finding a space to just be left alone to live your life.
Yes.